Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, a podcast by MedComms experts. We share medical communications insights and advice from the best and brightest in the industry to find out what they're doing to push our industry forward. Here's your host, Wesley Porteges.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, the podcast where we explore bold ideas that shape the future of medical affairs. Today, we're joined by Raj Patel. He is an expert in scientific communications with over a decade of experience driving publication strategies and data dissemination. Raj currently serves as a director worldwide medical oncology in medical communications at BMS. And in this episode, we'll dive into the strategies that he employs to bridge the communication gap between pharma and community healthcare professionals, including how can we leverage non-traditional publication channels and optimizing the visibility of data. Raj, it's amazing to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Wesley. I'm excited to be here.
My pleasure. Let's start with some background here. You have had quite a few different roles, from publications to strategic planning. What would you say has been the most rewarding aspect of your work, and how has your approach evolved over the years?
So I think it's changed significantly over the years. I think the most rewarding thing to me is always seeing a paper getting cited in guidelines, seeing an HCP making like a casual reference to something that we publish, specifically, especially if they quote a specific line that we put into the conclusion or something, right? Because it really shows that what you're saying, your communication points are really resonating with your target audience, right?
Absolutely. So we had a nice discussion some time ago, and you were telling me about something that I've been hearing a lot too, which is around the concept that we have some pretty good channels to reach academic audiences and our key opinion leaders or key external experts or whichever term we use. But then when it comes to a large group of the physicians that need to know this data as well, we're kind of lacking in that department. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because I think traditionally there's been a very heavy focus on those key opinion leaders, the thought leaders, the idea that if they understood the data, it would trickle down to the community, right? Because of their influence and their reach. And I think that may have been true way back when, but I feel like now with the glut of information and just the pace of everything, things are falling through the cracks, right? And I think, the approach from an academic or a thought leader is very different from that of a community HCP, right? Like academics, they're much more proactive in terms of looking for and getting data because they're also doing the research, right? So they want to make sure they're as up to date as possible, and they'll take the time, because they have the time, to actually read the different articles and things related to their area of expertise, right? I feel like community HCPs tend to be a little bit more reactive, right? So if they see a patient come in with a specific set of circumstances or characteristics, then they'll start looking out for information, right? So they won't try to just have a very broad understanding in general, right? They'll be looking to answer some very specific questions. And I think because of that, you need to approach those two as two very different audiences, right? You can't expect both of them to go to the same place to want to see the information in the same way. So I think we need to tailor our strategies for each of those audiences distinctly.
Yeah, so basically, I guess the two most powerful channels that we have in medical communications, field medical and conferences, are all geared towards that same more academic audience. I guess a generalized statement, but there's truth to that when you look in practice. That's what you're saying, right?
Yep.
Now, knowing that these community physicians are typically, I would say they're time poor and have a super high patient load, maybe a little bit more difficult to reach. Like, what kind of strategies have you used or have you found to be most impactful reaching this audience?
I think a lot of it comes down to meeting them where they are, right? So wherever they're already going to, whatever they're already used to accessing, I think is probably the best place, right? So some of it is, more traditional, right? So making sure we're in the guidelines, right? Especially within oncology, there's all sorts of guidelines and different committees, right? And we can submit requests to make amendments and updates to those guidelines, right? I think IME is another really great example, right? Like it's something that is, again, very traditional, something that's been happening for a long time, but it does have a very extensive reach. They all, especially in the US, need to do, ongoing education and continuing education credits, and IME provides that, right? So I think those are some more traditional ways. And obviously, there's the newer digital platforms as well, right? So they are looking in other places, right? There's obviously the big, well-known sites like Medscape and others, right? But they're also engaging with each other on LinkedIn, on X or Facebook or other social media type platforms as well, right? And so I think we have to really see where they're going and try to get our content or our information onto those sites, or at least at the very least links back to those Congress presentations and those papers that we've done, right? So if they are looking for something, they come across it, then they can ideally go back to the source, quote unquote, right, to the peer-reviewed publication.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I like how you said digital as well, because I really see the opportunity of extending these activities beyond, like, if you look at a conference, for instance, right? Like, even when the other audience isn't really at the conference, we can use digital strategies to extend the data and the messaging that comes from that conference to these community physicians as well. So is there any specific example where you were successful reaching these community HCPs with data that, may have otherwise gone unseen?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, and it started kind of as more luck, right? So we had a methodology paper for one of our clinical studies published, and the lead author had been reached out to by like what we call the trade journal, or like a non-peer reviewed publication, right? It was an online website focused in urology, right, for urologists that posted on a broad range of topics. And they asked him to develop a summary for this methodology article. And then he reached out to us saying, hey, could we provide support? It took a lot of work with our compliance teams and everything else to kind of get that approval done, right? But we worked with that site to, one, confirm that they will be okay with pharma participating, and obviously whatever appropriate disclosures and things that we would need to include. And they were completely fine, and they were actually very happy to work with us. So we were able to do that. And again, like, this article wasn't necessarily targeted to the community, but it was something we wanted to do to raise awareness for the study. But using that as an example, what we found was after that article on that site was published, it received, I think, close to 10,000 views over the course of a few months. And within 1 month of it being published, it actually more than doubled the views of the original methodology paper that we had published in the peer-reviewed journal, right? So we saw very immediately the impact, right, that this had. And obviously this website catered specifically towards the community HCPs, right? It provided very short, succinct summaries of congresses, of various articles that were published. And what that did was that kind of sparked us to do a lot more research, right? So one, obviously we reached out to the site to get some feedback on what we already sent them, if they'd be willing to work with us in the future. We also ask them questions around, like, metrics for different types of articles, different formats, what were their preferences, right? What they saw resonated with the audience more. Did they like videos? Did they like text, et cetera, et cetera? And then we worked with legal and compliance to basically establish a more formalized process, right? We had done this as a pilot, as a one-off, and now that we wanted to try to do this more often, we started working with them to really come up with what's the best, most compliant way to go about doing this. And then the third thing we did was we looked at what types of articles and content the site posted, right? Where were they pulling from? What congresses were they going to? What journals were they going to? Who were the authors of these articles? Things like that, to see, okay, as we try to plan this out, where do we want to target our different data endpoints? Which authors do we want to potentially try to work with? So we have a higher chance of basically having this ask come to us, right? We can't proactively go to them saying, hey, here, we have this data, can you feature it? But we can try to leverage other strategies to make it more visible and more likely for them to select it.
Yeah. So basically, this was kind of a coincidence. And it sounds a bit like how PR would work. So, we can call this PR for scientific data. Now, what made the website pick this one up, and maybe not others?
Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, right? Because based off of what we found out, they had a steering committee of experts, right? So of those academics, of those thought leaders, and they would be the ones selecting the different articles and different things to feature. I think, again, because the study was pretty unique, it was one of a kind, at least at the time, within prostate cancer. And a lot of them were actually part of the study itself. I think that's kind of what led them to want to highlight it further. Right. And that's also part of the thought process that we use when, again, developing future studies and future publications, to say, hey, look, we need to maybe work with some of these people as authors. And yes, they're the traditional experts, but because of their involvement in things like this, it will then eventually help us expand the reach out to the community even further.
Yeah, that's a good point. It makes me think about influencers.
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. Right. There's influencers on social media and obviously within healthcare as well. Right.
Yeah. This is really interesting because, like, as you know, we're all looking for ways to expand, like, our digital reach towards community physicians or physicians in general, I would say. and often we're forking out quite big budgets to work with third-party platforms, or, we advertise on social media and all these things. And if you think about it, like if you can create something that is being picked up by, let's say, the media, who is then going to act as like a turbocharger on your dissemination, that is, of course, amazing. I asked you about like, why do you think this got picked up? And I know that's hard to know, of course, but what are some things that you're now considering in the future to make it more likely? So one thing I heard you say is we might look at different kind of authors and maybe invite them to the publication because of their involvement maybe in a group that publishes things online or communicates online. But any other ideas here?
So one of the things we saw was they did tend to pull a lot from specific journals, right? And this is being prostate cancer. They weren't exclusively going to like Journal of Urology and things like that, right? They were going to some smaller tier journals, the lower tier journals within the prostate and urology space, right? So like, okay, we might not want to publish our clinical data or secondary analyses there, but that could be a very good target for some of our HUR and real world research, right? And so we were able to do that. We obviously presented some of the data at clinical meetings, at congresses, but we also looked to publish in some of these journals, and we were actually successful in having it then be picked up and featured in this site as well.
Yeah. I think this particular example, the platform was Urology Today, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Are you aware of a lot of other platforms that could serve for that same purpose in the future?
I know depending on disease states, there's definitely a lot of very specific ones, right? There's definitely a lot in oncology, but I know there's also some that exist within diabetes and other therapeutic areas as well, right? And again, they all cater to different areas, right? Some are much more obviously community HCP focused, but others are actually more patient focused, right? Trying to bring the clinical data directly to the patients and kind of being run by the advocacy organizations, right? So I think, again, depending on what you're looking for, it's important to look and really try to see what exists, because again, they've already done a lot of the work to build their platform to get people to come to it, right? So rather than you trying to build something yourself, it's much easier to leverage that, right? And like you said, with the PR strategy, like it's going to drive a lot more views and interest than you trying to get people to come to a pharmaceutical company site.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was kind of indeed the context of my question, because I was thinking like how PR works, right? It's like, let's say someone has an idea about something they want to share with the world. And basically, there are platforms like PR Newswire or other press release services, and they send like a quick synopsis to all the news outlets, right? From the New York Times to the local little town newspaper or something like that. And it's a matter of volume, and then they're hoping that based on how the message was formed, that they pick up on it and talk about it, right? So this idea that comes up here is that could maybe be an approach here as well. It's like, what if we would know who these platforms are and understand what they would be looking for? And what if there was a way to get this information to them so they could pick this up?
Yeah, no, for sure. And even just like press releases, right? There's probably just as many press releases as there are peer-reviewed publications, right? So a lot of it is trying to figure out what the search terms are, right? What are people specifically looking for, and making sure that you're highlighting that very upfront, right? Either in the title, in the abstract, and things like that. So it does show up in those searches and then gets further amplified and further highlighted.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, of course, while I was kind of ideating here with you on how we could do that, the first thing that came to mind is like, what would compliance think about this? I'm sure you have had some conversations with them as well about this topic. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and so like I mentioned, that pilot project took about 8 months of work to actually get off the ground, largely because, again, the way the content was going to be disseminated, right? It was not peer reviewed, so it did not count as a publication. It wasn't going to be disseminated by the field medical team, so it didn't count as medical content. It was kind of somewhere in between, right? And so it was a very interesting journey, actually, because nobody I spoke to said no. They just said, I don't think this is the right process, right? They're actually all pretty excited about the idea, right? And I think that was important, is setting the stage with what are we trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish? Why are we trying to accomplish it, right? And getting them on board with that first. And by doing so, they were all very willing to work with me to come up with a new process, right? And so we ultimately came up with a pilot where we would route it similar to a medical content type piece, right? So something that we were developing for the field medical team, but with the caveat and the limitations that it had to stick with what was in the publication itself. We could not bring up other papers. We could not bring up other pieces and things like that. We had to stick with what was in that particular publication that we were asked to talk about, right? So I was like, that was pretty fair guardrails, I thought, right? So we were able to move forward with that as a pilot at first, and then eventually as a formal policy.
Yeah, so what would you say was the biggest challenge compliance-wise?
So I think, again, it will probably depend on company, right? But I would say the biggest challenge was that first step, is really getting the team to understand the rationale as to why we wanted to do this, right? So why weren't our existing platforms or existing avenues enough? So I think that was the first part. And then the second part was also how what we are proposing, right? What this idea was, isn't really that different from something that was already existing, right? It's not that far off from full peer review because, look, they had an external steering committee. They reached out to us, right? We weren't doing anything proactive to get them to do it. It's still based off of a scientific publication, right? It's still peer reviewed, right? So trying to draw those parallels was difficult, but again, I think it really resonated with the legal and compliance teams and what ultimately led them to agreeing with us to do this.
Is MedComms evolving faster than your team can keep up? You're not alone, and you don't have to navigate it alone. Wesley Portages, host of Transforming Medical Communications, is offering a limited number of free 30-minute consultancy sessions for medical affairs professionals. Whether it's medical communications, field medical, or medical affairs training, these sessions provide an opportunity to address your real-world challenges, pressure test ideas, and walk away with practical strategic insight for your team. No fluff, just strategy. Follow the on-screen link or in the show notes to book your free session now.
So I'm thinking about, again, like the parallel with PR, right? So you send a press release and then outlets pick it up if you're lucky. But you don't really have a say in that. So they pick it up and they take the information you shared and they kind of make their own story. So in this particular case, did Urology Today already publish this before you even knew about it? Like, did you discover it was just online, or was there more of like a collaboration? Did they reach out and ask whether they could put that online on their website or not, or these kind of things?
Yeah, so it was definitely a little bit more collaborative. I mean, they reached out to the lead author, and then that author reached out to us. So there is a scenario where the author just says, okay, does something and sends it back to them without looping us in, right? And I think that definitely does happen, right? If you look at their site, they do feature all kinds of different studies, and there's no disclaimer on there saying, this was sponsored by this company or this was sponsored by that company, right? So I know a lot of companies might decline because of compliance issues, right? But the authors are free to respond themselves, right? Because, they're the author, they own the research just as much as we do, right? So I think a lot of cases they do respond, but in this case, because the author reached out to us, Uro Today was willing to work with us and kind of be patient as we work through the process. And then ultimately we were able to provide them the content that they put on their site.
And the content, was that any different of what they could have obtained directly without your involvement?
I think a little bit, right? So again, we did talk to Uro Today to see what they preferred and what they liked. And what they told us was, typically when the HCPs did it themselves, they would get, maybe a small write-up or a basic video recording of themselves. But because we were working with them, we were actually able to kind of create some infographics. We created a more polished video that zoomed in and out on different data points and things like that. And they really liked that. And they said it really resonated well and probably led to the vast majority of the views that we were able to see.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Because in the beginning, you mentioned some pretty impressive numbers, right? So clearly this had a huge impact. And I guess this was only one of the major outlets picking it up. So imagine if that would be wider, right?
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
And this is really cool. So you worked on the content together in some different formats. What was like steering most? Like, could they tell you what works best? So was the infographic and the video like something they suggested based on their analytics and knowing what works on the website?
Yeah, exactly that, right? So we had reached out to ask them, for this particular type of content, what would they prefer? But then also in general, right? Again, like I said, we did have some examples with HEOR research, right? And there they said, they really like videos because of the nuance of the data and the analysis. It was really helpful, or they felt it was really helpful for somebody to talk through how the analysis was done itself, right? And then speaking to the results, obviously, right? And so for those, we developed a video as well as a short summary.
Yeah. And the summary was an infographic, I understood.
For one of them, yeah. But for the other ones, it was a little bit more of like a traditional kind of abstract type summary.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. And were they willing to provide you with like some outcomes or metrics or anything like that?
Yeah, like I said, it was very great to work with them. They were willing to provide and kept providing updated numbers right over time for the articles themselves. And the way that they work is they would link directly back to the paper or the Congress presentation as well. And so we were actually able to use a bit.ly link or a shortened link where we were able to get specific tracking information as well. So we saw the direct impact of the views on the actual article too, right? So obviously we saw a huge bump in general, but the one thing that I thought was interesting is that we were able to see, okay, maybe the site received 1,000 click-throughs from the article on Neuro Today. But what we saw on the actual publication page was, maybe like 1,200 or 1,500 views, right? Which we assumed to mean that somebody clicked on it, went to the article, and then shared the article with a colleague, right? So it got a little bit of a further lift because one person was able to discover it and reach out and send it to somebody else.
Yeah. Like, I guess in marketing lingo, that would call that influenced conversions.
Yep.
Right? Yeah. I know we're talking about medical affairs here, but from a content analysis and efficacy perspective, that's definitely interesting to also think about, okay, what are the positive side effects of this happening?
Yes.
Now, previously, you mentioned also the journal selection having an impact on whether this may or may not be picked up by sites like these. Why do you think that is? I was wondering about that. Like, why would they pick certain journals over others?
I mean, I think some of it has to do with open access, or probably a large part of it has to do with open access, right? Because like I mentioned, their model is they would provide a short summary and then they will provide a link to the paper, right? And I think one distinction that people probably know but don't always think about is community HCPs don't subscribe to every single journal, right? Like you would at an academic center, right? So they don't have the luxury of just being able to click on any link and opening it up to read the full article. So I think that was definitely one piece of it that was very important. I think the other piece is just what the journal offered, right? So this particular journal also offered infographics and videos to be put as part of the paper itself. And I think, again, like they were able to either link directly to those videos or they knew that kind of content resonated with their audience. And so that was one of the reasons why they preferred that journal.
Oh, so that's interesting. So in the beginning, we spoke about community HCPs having less access, right, to conferences and of course, field medical. But you're saying that also getting to all the journals and especially maybe high tier, high impact factor journals is also more limited among that audience?
I think it can be, right? Because most journals have a subscription cost, right? So unless you're willing to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for access to multiple journals, you might pick one, maybe two or three, right? But you're not going to be able to subscribe to everything like a large hospital or institution is able to.
Yeah, that makes sense. I didn't really realize that actually. And knowing that it's a completely different field on journal selection, I actually like that thought. It's not what we're used to, right? So if you would be speaking with a peer, at your company or another company for that matter, but like someone who is listening to this podcast perhaps and thinking like, wow, this is so cool. I want to try the same. And you would need to give them a 3-step plan to get there. What would you recommend?
So I would say the first step is to very clearly identify your audience. And then based off of that, do a lot of research into where and how they're looking for information. And then maybe step 2B is to then see which of those sites are ones that you can either partner with directly, and then if not directly, see how you could potentially indirectly partner with them, right? So my example was a case where we were indirectly partnering with them, right? We had to wait for them to reach out to us, but then we could start working with them to create the content, right? So I think you have to figure all of that out. So then I think you have to try to make sure you have the right communication points for that audience. And then again, are going to the right outlets in terms of congresses or journals so it can be leveraged by those different platforms.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, it really sounds like you're onto something new here. And I haven't really heard about this before. And I'm talking a lot about these topics. So this is really exciting. How about like the cross-functional impact of something like this? Do you feel that comes into place? We think about like maybe the commercial team, especially if we're talking about like large scale dissemination through websites and these kind of things.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it can have a huge impact, right? And I think you need to make sure you're working in partnership with the commercial team, at least as far as aligning on the key communication points and the target audiences, right? I think if you are able to do that, and then you're working on the communications, the publications and things more independently, right? Because of the guardrails and the firewalls that we have in place, then if something were to get picked up, you know that it's going to be aligned with the overarching strategy that you have for the product, right? So I think there's that whole internal piece that you have to do as part of planning and everything else. And with all these channels, especially because the commercial team is probably also working with these same channels, right? So again, today as an example, we'll have a lot of advertisements for products, right, that are paid for by the commercial part of the organization, right? So you don't need to be divulging specific tactics, right? But you need to make sure you're aligned on, again, the target audiences and what the communication points are going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to your point around knowing where your audience is or where they consume content, do you have any practical insights on that? How do you go about that?
Some of it might seem simple. You just ask, right? So you can leverage the field medical team, right? If they do have relationships with some of the more community audience, HCPs, or whoever your target audience is, that you can have them simply ask the question of, oh, hey, did you hear about this? Where did you hear about this? If you had this kind of question, where would you go, right? I think that's a very good starting point. Especially now, I think AI is a very useful place, right? Because you can basically ask it, say, hey, look, this paper was recently published. Can you tell me where you see citations of this appearing on other non-peer reviewed sites, right? And it can do a whole search and, it can find various media outlets and things like that. So I think that could definitely help you identify some sources, right? And obviously the third thing is we can potentially work with commercial, right? If they're buying ad space and things like that on certain sites, you could see where they're going, right? What their market research has been saying, and see if there's any way that you could potentially be interacting with those sites as well.
Yeah. I especially like your AI suggestion here. Mainly because I do believe that websites like these are actually really, really good at understanding their audience, and they are deep into tracking metrics and user behavior. So if they are actually publishing about things, it means their audience has an appetite for it by default, right? So I think that's a particularly effective but also affordable way of actually getting to this information. So that's a really cool suggestion. Thank you. It was really cool to talk about this particular case study and how you were able to get such a widespread dissemination for this particular study. How about other things, like outside what we have discussed? So what are other things that would help reaching these community physicians better?
I think some of it, unfortunately, comes down to the specific therapeutic area, right? Because again, everybody does things a little differently, right? Everybody has their own norms and things like that. And going back to some of the more traditional methods, right? I mean, I think IME is actually a great start. I used to refer to IME as like baby omnichannel, right? Because they produce content and develop it in a lot of different formats. And again, because the HCP is looking for these specific CEs, they're actively interested in these topics, right? So there's kind of self-selecting a little bit. So looking at those metrics and things like that can help you better understand what is and isn't resonating with your target audiences as well. But I think a lot of it just comes down to looking and seeing what you find, right? Like doing some searches online and maybe even reaching out to the thought leaders, right? To say, hey, are you producing any content or anything like that? Are you working with any of these channels and things, right? To see how they're doing their job as the experts and the thought leaders and influencing their respective areas as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Raj, thank you so much. This was such a great discussion. Thank you for sharing this wonderful experience that you've had. Before we close out here, I have a question for you. What is a topic that you are curious about and would like to hear more about? And perhaps it could be something I can talk about with another guest on this same show.
So I alluded to it a little bit already, right? But I think it would be very interesting to see how people are leveraging AI within scientific communications or medical communications, right? Obviously, a lot of journals and congresses have put up a strict no AI generated content rule, right? Which obviously we can maybe try to push back on, but we do need to follow. But that said, there's probably 100, 1,000 different ways that we could still be leveraging it, right? So I'd be very interested to hear about that.
Amazing. Well, I'm curious about that too. So let's see if we can make it happen. Raj, thank you so much again for your time. It was a pleasure to have you on the show. And thank you for sharing all your insights.
Yeah, it was great talking to you.
Transforming Medical Communications is brought to you by MedCom's experts. To find out more about MedCom's experts and how we create some of the most cutting-edge medical communications programs anywhere in the world, visit www.medcoms-experts.com. And then make sure to search for Transforming Medical Communications in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at MedCom's experts, thanks for listening.